Welcome to the Online Bodyguard podcast with host Philip Brindell, CEO and founder of Diffuse, a global threat and intelligence consultancy that blends psychology and intelligence to mitigate threats and risks to prominent people and brands.
So hello again and welcome to the Online Bodyguard with Philip Brindell from Diffuse, and today I have a very special guest, James Hamilton. So James is the Senior Vice President of Quality and Protection and Training at Gavin Becker Associates. I'm going to read James's bio because it's a really quite extraordinary bio with huge amount of experience and expertise, and it deserves being read out because it deserves the credit that it needs. And so let me read this out to you. James leads the Protection Quality Team, which conducts audits of Gavin Becker Associates' protective programs to ensure their strategies align with their clients' unique needs and to ensure their protectors meet their training and fitness standards and their certification requirements. He also manages the review of emergency incidents at their clients' properties with the goal of enhancing their services to their clients. James co-created their active shooter prevention and response methodology. He's trained thousands of employees at Fortune 500 companies, schools, universities, police departments and government agencies in the US and internationally on advanced concepts relating to the protection of including active shooter, surveillance detection, attack recognition, foreign weapons, executive protection and travel safety. He's also an instructor at their Essential Protection Skills Academy and their Advanced Threat Assessment Academy. He is one of the world's true experts on protection. James was recruited from the FBI, where he'd previously created and developed their Academy's Close Protection course, currently taught to protectors of the US Attorney General, the Director of the FBI, the NSA and the NYPD, amongst other agencies. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. He's a member of ACE's Executive Protection Council, and he's certified as an instructor in Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training called ALERT with 2 R's. That's a hell of a resume, James.
Thank you, sir.
So it's really great to talk to you, and you know, you are one of the world's true experts on this subject, and that's why it's going to be so interesting, because what we want to talk about, and we've chatted about this previously, and I'm delighted that we're both as fascinated and as interested in the same subject, is think what we've come to call the strategy of protection. So let's kind of go from something that I think that I know is really passionate to you, and that is, you know, you were an FBI agent working in protection details within the FBI with all the government resources available to you. And then you move into the private sector. Tell me about the differences. You know, when you're working for a private sector, you know, let's be honest, one of the most reputable ones in the world, and you come out the FBI, is it the same? What's different?
Right. Well, the taxpayers don't get a vote is the first thing I would say. Is, you know, in the U.S. government, the taxpayers are footing the bill, and they have no idea, you know, whether that agent's competent or not, and they don't get to say yes or no, and they don't get a vote. Whereas in the private sector, the client votes every single day with their pocketbook. So that was one of the biggest things, is the resources that you do not have in the private sector versus what we had in the government. If you know, I was on advance and I said I need 5 agents, I'd get 5 agents and there wouldn't be any questions. It's just not that way in the private sector. It's totally different. So, you know, you have to do things differently. And I would tell you that I was very slow to learn most of this. You know, I came from the FBI's tactical program. I was a SWAT guy. That's where they always recruited from to be on protection. Because in America, you know, we equate guns to protection, which, you know, that's a whole segment. We could do a whole podcast on that. And I really kind of believed that. And I didn't really understand anything about strategy. The reason I had to create a school is because we didn't really have a school. I mean, that's kind of the answer on that resume is, you know, we were kind of just, you know, on the job training and a couple of PowerPoints, and we were off and running. But I had to create an actual school to train these folks, you know, from the lessons I had learned. And that's probably not the best way to do business. You know, it reminded me a lot of the Alfred Herrhausen assassination if you're familiar with that one, and, sending GSG-9 in to do a close protection mission, and they didn't really understand route analysis that well. Kind of the same deal. I learned an awful lot about like what Gavin does through making mistakes, and then, creating the school and reading his books and starting to really understand protective strategy. Hell, I might have done some things that had a term. I didn't know they had a term. I just thought it was smart. So I'm happy to talk about all that. But yeah, to answer your question specifically, the biggest difference is resources. The biggest difference is getting buy-in from a client and getting them to pay the money, pay the freight.
And in terms of the information that's available to you to analyze threats, that must be quite different as well.
It is. Well, there's two things on that. One is in the private sector, and today in 2022, there's so much more available than there was to me, back when I was in the government. So that's one thing. It's very nice in the private sector. They have the ability to not only have, like, we have a threat assessment division. And we have a whole cadre of threat assessment professionals over there. Whereas like in the government, it was just an ancillary duty for a person on the detail. So let's say one of the agents, he had transport, the other agent was in charge of the guns, and the other agent was in charge of the medical program. Well, one agent was in charge of threat assessment. Well, that's probably not the best way to do business. You probably need a dedicated full-time person who understands, threats and intelligence and is culling that information. But, we weren't doing it that way. I mean, they are doing it now, but it's been a while. But that's one of the biggest things I see is in the private sector, we do have the resources to access information, use technology effectively. The government doesn't do a great job of that. And, get that information out to the people that really need it.
Yeah. So I suppose what we can take away there, they have the resources in terms of the number of people they can deploy on a detail, because they're not necessarily worrying about the bottom line when it's within the government.
Right.
But they may not necessarily have the same investment in the technology and the front end analysis and all that sector. So, but in the private sector, we probably better or got more access to some of that technology and intelligence gathering and what have you, but less reliant on the physical assets that we're going to deploy.
Yeah, you have to be smarter. So when you have less resources or physical bodies, doing that protection, well, then you've got to force multiply somehow. You do that through technology. You do that through information. You do that through working smarter and, really being much more knowledgeable about the craft. That's one of the big other separators. I think in the UK, you guys have an actual national standard for a close protection officer. I think that's true. We don't have that in the U.S., right? So that's a real thing, and we have to probably discuss some of that. There's no U.S. license for a close protection officer. Every state's a little bit different. So for us, we got to train everyone ourselves internally and make them smart about the criticality of protective intelligence. How that forms a strategy. What is the threat? All those things. And that kind of feeds into proper protection with less resources.
Yeah.
If you've got 100 guys on a detail or girls on a detail, they can probably forget protective intelligence because they got so many people. I call that being in love with a profile, by the way. There's a name for that. And I don't think that's the best way to do business. But when you have 100 agents out there and you can tow every car in the street, well, protective intelligence is less important to you, frankly.
So just let me clear then. So in the US, as I understand it, you need a license to be a private detective.
Yeah.
But you don't need
most
a license.
states. It's state by state. It's not US.
But generally speaking, you need a license to be. First you need a license to carry a weapon, presumably, or to conceal weapon, or what have you.
Well, to do protective work with a gun, you need yes. Right. But there are some. If you're just a citizen wanting to carry a gun, there's some states that just allow it. You only need a permit.
Yeah. So
it's state by state.
So let's move on then. So when you're recruiting people into your academy, when you're looking at, what are you actually looking for? What's the sort of baseline of what you're expecting to see that you're then going to train?
Okay. Well, for us, for 41 years, we've pretty much identified, our niche, right? What type of clients are attracted to our folks? So we are definitely looking for, a certain, look. So before they even come to us, they have to do a physical fitness test, period. So they have to pass that to even come to us. And so once they've passed that, that's on either in person or videotaped. Then when they come to us, we begin the training, but it's not like the military or police academy where you have a job and then we're just training you to put you on a detail. No, we're still looking at you and evaluating you because, it's a business. Maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe there's not a spot, but we're training with them all about mindset. Getting them knowledge. First of all, are you smart? That's the very first thing I'm looking for. Are you smart? And we learn that through our recruitment process, how intelligent they are, in communication, written and verbal and Zoom. Because being smart is critical. I can teach you how to, pull ups, running, shooting, all those things. We can teach you a lot of that, but you got to be intelligent, right? So that's the very first thing we're looking for. Are you smart enough to understand the job and the risks that come with the job? And then we train them on the physical aspects, the hard skills, those types of things. But at the end, it's really about the brain. How smart are these people? And those are the ones that for me, that's what I want to hire.
And so what sort of qualities does that mean then in terms of when you're looking at an individual? I mean, presumably you must have a high intake from the military and from law enforcement, but you must get quite a lot of people who also come from backgrounds where they've not no previous military or policing experience.
Yeah, it's very, very, and I apologize. I should have answered that question a little bit more succinctly in that we have very, very similar standards to law enforcement and military in the U.S., meaning, you can't come to us with a criminal background.
Sure.
You have to be able to pass a polygraph, background investigation. You can't have a bunch of arrests, drug use, all of those kind of standard things. And so we are literally competing for the same type of individual that the police departments are looking for, the FBI, fire department. And so that's a big piece of, there's a competition for this talent because, it's not as prevalent as it used to be. There's great studies about the, U.S., what's going on in the U.S. with regards to height and weight standards and all those things. So we are definitely competing for those people. That's what we're looking for. And then once we can kind of get that initial, kind of think about a mold, get that initial piece of clay, and then we're going to start to, kind of input a lot of information and how do they take it? Are they smart? We do peer evals in their class, hey, who would you most like to work with? Who would you least like to work with? Well, that matters. You've been on protective details. That's critical. If a guy is nice in front of the instructors, but he's a real jerk back in the barracks, well, that's a problem. And we're immersive. So we have a barracks. Our people are living there. They're not going to a hotel at night and just putting on a show for us for 8 hours. No, it's full on. And we'll see in that during that time whether you're cut out for this work or not, because some people just aren't. And that's one thing I like to tell them is, the work itself is difficult. I was gone 297 days my first year on a protective detail. It's hard on family. You're living another person's life. It's very, very difficult. It's not for everybody. This job is not for everybody. It really, really, it is very difficult being a close protection person. So, for everyone listening that does it, you have all my respect because it's not an easy job.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've never been a protection officer, but I've worked with quite a lot of them, and I know that a huge amount of work that is done is research and reconnaissance and pre-work, and then there's an awful lot of work as well when you're sat in a corridor, for instance, or you're sat outside a meeting room, or you're not. It looks like you're not doing anything, but actually you have to still remain switched on. When you're sat outside a corridor and your principal's asleep overnight, you're not just sat in a corridor, you're actually there for a reason. So that's that mindset again about being switched on. It's not all glamorous. It's not like the TV or the film shows. And so you have to be patient, I guess, and you have to have other qualities that require self-discipline.
Discipline, and you have to, we talk a lot about ethos and virtues, and I think unfortunately people throw those words around like everyone has virtue or ethos. They don't. I'm just telling you, people either live by that or they don't. Everyone doesn't just have those things, but courage, duty, honor, integrity, those types of things are real, and some people live by them and some do not. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for all of those things, but courage being probably the biggest. I always say, hey, when it's 3 a.m. and a guy jumps the fence and he's coming to the house and you're it, law enforcement's not close enough. Do you have the courage to go stop that individual? Because there's no help. You may be in a situation where that's it, and do you have the courage to go out there and put it on the line? A lot of people don't, and we train for that. We do a lot of, very interesting training. I'm sure you've seen it online. I mean, we do stress inoculation with attack dogs, and we do a lot of stuff to test courage because we need to know, can you stand where other people, and people don't want to stand there. Okay. When you're getting shot at or you're taking, whatever's coming at you at the motorcade or at the walking formation, a lot of normal people don't want to stand there. They don't want to turn and face, the bad guy like Tim McCarthy on the Reagan shooting. They don't want, that's not, humans are all about protecting yourself, right? That's how we're conditioned. So you've got to be willing to turn and protect that principle, that, protectee, we call them. And that's very rare. That's, everyone doesn't have that. And so, we're really testing courage and looking to see, do you have what it takes to go do what we're asking you to do? Not easy.
But would I be right in saying that even though that's a key quality, that the reality is that those incidents are still rare, and the vast majority of your work is not really doing that. It's probably diffusing hostile situations or arguments or difficult people or what have you.
Yeah, it's a lot of logistics, and it's a lot of interpersonal skills. There's a lot of dealing with EAs or house state managers or changes of schedule and luggage count. I mean, it's a lot of these other things. It's very rarely you're dealing with these attacks and all that stuff. But the challenge is that if you think your job is just to do logistics and you fall into that complacency, and then you're snapped right back into it when that guy jumps the gate or the guy comes at the motorcade, well, it's on. And that's the challenge. We talk a lot about being what we call the now. We train for that. We purposely try to take a student out of the now, make them think about something else, and then we attack because that's the discipline. All right. That's the reality is you're standing there for 3, 4, 5 hours. Your feet are hurting. Your wife's nagging you because you're missing the kid's birthday for the 4th time. You've been on detail 4 years, and you've got to have the discipline to not listen to that crap. Well, first of all, don't look at your phone, right? And do what you're being paid to do. And believe me, that is just not easy. That's why, again, I give all the shout out and to all the protectors out there, especially, our guys and girls. I mean, thank you. It's not easy. It is just not easy.
And also, we talked beforehand about this whole thing around the protective intelligence and understanding why you're there.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's kind of the beginning, right? So engineering will tell us all that you get that information, you put the best stuff in to get the best product out. So for me, on the intake, what we would call client intake, when we in an engagement, a lot of times it happens because they're unhappy with who they have, or they just think they need protection or whatever, or something's actually happened. There's been a threat, there's been a guy at the door, or email, phone call, letter. That's one of the very first things we want to understand is what is the threat to you? Has there been a recent risk assessment? Can we see it? How did you fill those gaps? What's going on with you? Because we have to form that. And I ask every protector on an audit, my company or other companies, hey, what is the threat to your protectee, right? And I want to hear, okay, well, they're a high net worth individual, there's a kidnapping concern, or there's a violence concern, or there's an assassination concern. What I don't want to hear, or even a medical concern, let's say they have some type of ongoing medical condition and they've hired a protective firm to keep them safe because they can't hire a doctor or whatever. I always want to know that. And if they say to me, well, there's no threat, I always say, well, you might want to check yourself, because if there's no threat, there's no need for you to be here, right? There has to be a reason. There has to be something going on, and you need to know what that is. What's terrible, I think, is when I find protectors who just say, well, I'm not sure. I just got hired for the day. Not my company, but when I do audits of other companies, I'm like, well, that's not very fair, because you don't even know what you're going up against. That's not right. So I'd like to understand that first, and then we kind of go through the process of, are we the right match? Because, we're very different, and, we do things differently.
So what's the difference then between I'm going to kind of paint probably a bit of a generalisation here, but what's the difference between a trained person who's a close protection operative and one of these guys we see with a celebrity who's kind of 8 foot tall in sunglasses and maybe a previous doorman or something, but is he a bodyguard or is he a minder? Is there a difference between those two terms?
I think it's all kind of. I think it's semantics. I don't know how these folks are trained. Just because someone's large, I don't know if they've been trained or not. Maybe they have. But for us, for me, a close protection person, protector, bodyguard is an individual that has been trained in the art of protecting human beings, who's dedicated their life to it, meaning this is all they do. I would say that if you're, a police officer off duty, which, we can look at all kinds of examples of that, especially in the U.S., where they say, well, he's a bodyguard. Well, no, he's not. Okay. That's not fair. I saw a LinkedIn post the other day about an individual saying, these protection fails, and they listed out incidents, right? Well, Salman Rushdie is not a protection fail because he didn't have close protection people assigned to him, right? So that's not fair. Right. He had a state police officer or police officers in the back of the crowd doing security for the event. It's not fair to call that a protection fail because they didn't have close protection officers there. So for me, that's what we do. We broad brush these things. But that's not, to me, what a bodyguard is. You can be 8 feet tall or huge like you see and not be a bodyguard. You're just basically been told, hey, you're doing my security, but you have no training. You have no background. You have no equipment. You really have no idea what you're doing. I call that the turtle on the fence. And for many of your listeners, they may be from the UK. I don't know if you know what that means. In the South, if that's where I'm from in the US, if you see a turtle on the fence post, well, you know some things. You know that that turtle didn't get up there on his own, and some bastard put him up there, and that turtle has no idea what he's doing. Right. And I sometimes say, that unfortunately there are people in close protection or the bodyguard world, especially in the U.S., who are the turtle on the fence post. A client has said, oh, you're my bodyguard. And he's just standing out there and he really doesn't know what he's doing. And it's not his fault. Well, I guess it's his fault, but he hasn't been trained. But again, because if nothing ever happens, and he assumes I'm doing a great job. And the client starts to say, oh, yeah, he's doing great. And I'm paying him $5 an hour. So it's awesome.
Yeah.
Until what? Until it's not. Until something happens.
And so that leads us on to this other subject, which I know you and I have talked about, which is about, value and about return on someone's investment within that industry. And I'll preface this by saying, I've had a conversation in the last few weeks with people in the UK where they've expressed concern about the reason people get the role in some of the close protection residential security is not based on competence, it's based purely on price. And it's about bums fitting seats rather than the quality of the professional that they're being employed. So how does a security provider demonstrate value?
Right. Well, it's that daily, a daily interaction with a client. First of all, the first impression they have is, and that's when we do an intake, we explain exactly how we're different. And these folks are protectors, meaning this is their job and this is all they do. Okay. And you're going to be getting, kind of the best that we can offer you. And you make the decision every day. You can tell whether this individual is good. I tell clients all the time, you can tell right away if this is a quality individual or not. And they're like, well, I don't know anything about protection. Yeah, well, people and you know how to make a first impression, right? And so that's like first thing. They take an appearance, they look at him and go, okay, and he's on time, he's professionally dressed, he's and this is a big one, and I really want to touch on this for a moment. But our industry does not help ourselves at all when we break confidentiality. Okay, when we start talking about the things we saw with whatever protectee, we kill ourselves because the one thing we're trying to establish is trust, right? It is extremely difficult to develop and get trust from another human being, right? And so, yeah, they might be paying for you, but they're not going to fully trust you. They don't even know you, right? And so if you tell them on the front end during the intake, hey, by the way, we have a confidentiality agreement, ours is 50 years. If anyone violates it, we're going to fire them. Okay, that starts to develop a little bit of trust because they don't want their stuff out there, right? That's part of being a bodyguard. Discretion, not telling everyone what you've seen. That's important, right? Because we want the client to trust us. And so, that's a big piece of it. And then the return on the investment piece is, okay, if you, how do you show them value? Well, a lot of it is efficiency, just making their life easier, getting from point A to point B faster and more efficient, safer, all those things. But for the accountants, or what we call the bean counters, at the end of the year, they look at this huge security budget and like, well, what are we getting for that? Right. And well, if you're not banging them every day with reports, emails, activities, and nothing, I've done audits of teams and they've said, well, we don't do a report unless something happens. Wow. Well, in this business, you might not have anything happen for the whole year. And if that's your reality, the accountant at the end of the year is going to have nothing to go on. What have you done? Versus, if you're talking about a daily activity report, you're talking about a threat assessment report of all of your known threats, how those things are meeting with your protective team. That goes in a daily activity report, that you're looking for this individual that was spotted at the client's business, and now they might be in the client's neighborhood. As time and distance from those two things is a problem. Now you're getting somewhere. Now you're showing, hey, we contacted this individual because we were notified that he had been suspiciously acting at the client's business, and now he's showing up at the home. We contacted law enforcement. He was interdicted, blah, blah, blah. Now they start to see the value, right? One of my favorite things is when I read a client say, I'm so glad that you're here. I wouldn't know what to do without you. That's how I know, okay, we're doing the right work. They are starting to trust us. They understand, what we provide. It's not just the bullets and the vest and all that. No, it's the logistics. It's the trust that they have that you can safely move them from point A to point B. And if you can do it quicker, as you know, in a business world, that's great. That's return on investment, especially when that guy, you don't want that guy driving. If you're a billionaire and you're driving to work, how much money do they make an hour or a minute? It's a lot. So, let us drive you. It's a lot safer and you can get more work done. But that's how, I think you show return on the investment. Yeah.
So it's a really interesting point about trust, because I, as you know, I was an investigative detective. So I investigated everything from child abuse upwards. And sometimes people would come to us and they wouldn't tell you everything up front that was going on. Mm-hmm. They would drip feed something into you to see how you responded with that. And, whether it was confidential, etc. And only when they trusted you would they then start actually revealing the real issues. So I guess from your perspective, it's the same in terms of once you've got that trust, only then perhaps do they then start opening up and telling you what's really bothering them or what's really been going on in that dynamic.
Well, and there's a lot of nuance here. I mean, in the sector, what we do, you might have a director of security that's hiring you to do the protective work, and you may not even meet with that client. And, that first time you meet with that client is, Monday morning at 8 a.m., you're picking them up and they're like, who are you? Well, I was just hired by your director of security. Well, man, that's a very difficult situation because this principal has no idea who you are. He just, I guess, trusts this director of security to put you on there. To me, you got to get some face time. We would like to with the client to understand, what is going on with you, right? Because they keep things close, and you might have a director of security or the corporate entity. They don't know about the threats that are going on at the home. You need to know that as a close protection officer, right? And so we do start to see those things. But again, like you said, they're not going to open up until they trust that you're not going to be spreading. That's very, very important. And if you can't show confidentiality, if you're doing a situation where every day they're just hiring a retired or an off-duty police officer to sit outside the house, you're not going to know anything. They're not going to tell you anything. You're just some dude out in a car. That to me is probably not the best way to do it, but people do it that way.
Hi everyone, this is Philip Grindell, founder of the Online Bodyguard. The goal when creating this podcast was to share the wisdom and the expertise of the world's thought leaders with a wider audience. But we also want to ensure that our listeners enjoy lots of other free material. When you visit our website, diffuseglobal.com, go to the Resources tab. There, you can take a couple of short quizzes to gauge your knowledge and get a report to help increase your learning. We're going to be adding other material soon, so keep visiting the site and sign up for the newsletter for other offers. Now, back to the podcast. And so when you in terms of your training courses, you obviously have a training course that is for the bodyguards. Is the residential security, is that part of that, or is that a complete separate entity?
It is part of that. Because in the private sector, it's a la carte, meaning a client may pay just for residential security. They may pay for field coverage. They may pay for office coverage. They may pay for just travel coverage, right? So it's an a la carte. And obviously, we prefer a full on everything. And that's not a money thing. It's really just from a proper security protocol piece. If I, like I was kind of giving the example earlier, if I have a suspicious person showing up at the business, and then that same, that individual, let's say the security at the office is my people, then they, communicate that out to the team. And now the residential team is now looking for that individual. And then we see that car. Okay, now we're way ahead of the game in the planning process. You talk to, planning cycle, tax cycle. We can stop that very, very early. If you've got a corporate security team doing the coverage and then another company doing the coverage at the residence, and maybe, there's another, maybe just a chauffeur driving. Well, there's a lot of eyes out there and they may not be communicating what they're seeing. Versus, if I'm driving him, I will see that guy parked down, in the, right near the home in what we call red zone. And I'm going to get that license plate and I'm going to give it to the guys at the residence. I'm going to tell the guys at the company, hey, look out for this car. That's proper protection. And that to me is a full-time operation, but it's very expensive. And so, it's a la carte. Back to your question, at our training academy, they get it all because we don't know where they're going, right? So in our initial, we actually have 4 academies. So it's a 2-year process. So we do a lot of training of our personnel. That's not standard. It's not, there's no standard in the U.S. So, that's just what we do.
And so when we get into the kind of the more detailed part of some of the skill sets and the technicalities of what you do, talk to me about things like, the controlled spaces, how you control, the theory of that. How do you manage that? What does that look like?
Right. Well, we want to maximize our time in controlled areas. Okay. And that can be the home, that can be the office, that could be a venue, a hotel that you've advanced and you've got personnel waiting. Those are controlled venues, controlled spaces. We want to minimize our time in the uncontrolled areas, walking from the car to the venue, just walking a street. History is respite with individuals who are just walking in a street and get assaulted. And it could not just be an attack by knife, gun, spray. It could be an embarrassment type of an attack, with an egg or milkshake like, Nigel Farage had in I think that was London. Those uncontrolled spaces, we want to stay out of those. And one of the, a good example for me, I didn't even know what that was called. But when I was in the FBI, we would routinely stop in transit to get the boss coffee. Well, he's in an armored vehicle, right? So one day I was like, well, just keep him in there and I'll run in, I'll grab the coffee because the team's, in the trucks with him and I'll bring the coffee out. I didn't know what that was called. That's actually called the theory of controlled spaces, but I didn't know that. I just didn't think it was a good idea for him to go to that uncontrolled Starbucks in Washington, D.C. And then I handed him the coffee and we went, on our merry way. That's what I'm talking about, right? Don't increase your risk by putting your principal into an uncontrolled space if you don't have to. And so, by the way, a lot of these clients, they don't want to do that, right? Because they want to be out there. They want to be normal, if you will. They want to be able to walk around and shop. And if you're telling them, hey, we'd like to speed this up, those types of things, well, why are they going to do that? Well, first thing is they have to look at you as a professional, period. If you're the guy that just carries the shopping bags and helps them shop, they're not going to look at you as a professional. They're just not. They look at you as an assistant. then they have to also know that, you know what you're doing, meaning you've been trained in some way, and, you've got an intelligence feed telling you, hey, this area is a little bit concerning, because, people could get assaulted, not because of who they are, but just because where they are, right? I mean, in America, there's certain cities where, hey, I got to know the threat, just the general threat that's going on, so I can avoid that for my client. It's not about them by name. It's just, hey, New York subway system is dangerous right now, so maybe I want to avoid that. So that's a big piece of it. Theory of control spaces, also, create this thing we call white space. Create distance around the protectee, especially if you're doing something like known in advance. Salman Rushdie, that was known in advance. We all know the guy did pre-operational surveillance the day before. So if it's something where they can set up on you ahead of time, you really need some strategy, and that all comes back to training, right? So if I said to your listeners, what's the difference between protective and projective coverage? They're probably like, I don't know what you're talking about. And if you go to a venue, most of the time in the U.S. anyway, what I see is security or law enforcement. If they're doing some type of security for someone, they're usually out of position. They're not in protective coverage. Is you're close enough to protect the protectee, cover and evacuate from the threat. Projective coverage is you're going to the threat. You're going out into the crowd or at that first person in that front row, stopping the threat. The knife, the gun in our country, the egg that's coming over. Well, when I say those two terms, if someone says, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, first of all, I know they don't really have any training. Or they'll say, well, I'm standing in no man's land, meaning you're in the back of the auditorium. Most law enforcement officers like to stand with their back to a wall. Why? Because they can keep everything in front of them. Well, that's probably one of the worst positions to be standing as a close protection person, because it's up there. That's where it is. Gavin, my founder, my mentor, he says, hey, we're being paid to block the layup, like a basketball analogy, but you have to be on the court. You can't be in the stands. So a lot of, protection people are, a lot of people who are doing protection, I'm not saying the protection people, are out of position. Okay. And so why is that? Well, it's either they're not trained properly, or this is more important, the client says, I don't want to see you, right? Because they don't respect you. They don't respect you as a bodyguard. They just think you're that dude that carries your shopping bag or whatever, and they'll tell you where to stand. That's probably not the way you want to do business. Like if you study the 81 Reagan shooting, I always talk about, thank God Jerry Parr was as close as he was to Reagan. Thank God, I don't know. I didn't know their relationship, but if Reagan had said, hey, I need you to give me some space to let them take my photo. Well, if Jerry hadn't been right where he was, less than an arm length away, maybe Hinckley's accurate that day and Reagan dies. So I'm always grateful that Jerry Parr was that close. And sometimes you have to be that close, but a professional knows that. And a person that's kind of just playing at this or has no training, they don't know where to stand. So that's a huge piece of it. And that's what we teach. And we train, and it's all in our book. I'm not kind of giving away any secrets. It's all in Just 2 Seconds, a book that Gavin wrote. But it's one of the only resources I'm aware of a study of more than 1,400 attacks. And what did we learn? And I mean, I always tell people, I don't care if you work for me or not. If you're going to be a close protection officer, read this book, right? And keep it as a reference. And, a lot of people are like, oh, I'm good. And I always say, if you're a close protection person and you've never read that book or referenced it, it's like a Christian who's never read the Bible.
We're talking
How do you know what you believe?
We're talking about Just 2 Seconds, aren't we?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Because there's two great books.
This one right here.
Yeah, there's Just 2 Seconds, and then there's The Gift of Fear, which are both, I think, seminal pieces of work in the kind of protective security industry. Just going back to one of your points, I mean, I think that must be where the kind of diplomacy and the communication skills has to come in, when you have protectees who are used to getting their own way, because of their prominence, their power, or their wealth. And there's that difficult relationship where you're still the employee as a protector, but you have to take the leadership role and be able to say, I'm going to be in this position, and this is why I'm going to be in this position. Because presumably, and as I stipulate, I am not a trained protector at all in that environment. The challenge would come when they say, no, I don't want you there, I want you over there, and that becomes where the relationship breaks down, and where you as your protector, as a trained protector, have to better stand firm and explain, no, I'm standing there and these are the reasons why.
And I think it's really, really dictated on your situation. And what I mean by that very specifically is, okay, in the government, okay, I can stand wherever I want. I can tell him whatever I want because he doesn't get a choice. A political appointee who gets a protective detail in the U.S. government really doesn't get a whole lot of choice, okay? He can't fire me. He can remove me. He can move me to somewhere else, but he really can't fire me, okay? So that's different. Then you've got, let's say you're a close protection firm with multiple clients, right? And you're an employee. And let's say you make that client angry because you're going to stand your ground, just like what you're describing. And that client says, I'm done with James. Get him out of here. Okay. Guess what? I can put James on another detail because I have multiple clients. James is probably more apt to stand his ground and say, no, I'm not going to stand in the back where you want me to. Then all the way to, let's say you're working directly for that client. Okay. As the bodyguard or close protection officer, you're being paid by them. It is going to take an unbelievable amount of courage to say no to someone that's literally paying your bill directly. And those that do it, they're out there. I mean, I give them all the respect in the world. But the people that can do that, I promise you, has developed over the years with that individual trust. They respect their ability. They respect their knowledge. They wouldn't be doing that if they didn't need to, right? And back to your earlier question, I'm sorry I didn't answer this as well as I'd like to have. Yes, we do hire a lot of military and former government folks, former law enforcement. But I tell you, the people that do really, really well for us are like concierge at a Four Seasons, right? They understand customer service. And there's a high degree of that in the private sector. That is part of our business. And I like those folks a lot because they understand how to talk to people. They understand that they have to provide a service, right? No offense to my, military or my law enforcement guys, but they don't understand that. They don't have to do customer service and law enforcement. You're getting paid no matter what. Well, you got to teach them that they think, I'm just doing what I'm going to do. Well, no, you got to give them customer service or they're not going to keep paying us. So yeah, that's a big piece of it. So again, based on your situation, I think it's a lot easier sometimes to stand your ground. But there are some situations where it's very, very difficult. And sometimes they don't. And that's why you see some of the things you see.
Yeah. And I guess that's why you have to have compromise.
Yeah, you can't be, it's my way, the highway. I mean, but when it happens, that's the other thing is they have to understand that, let's talk about like a cover and evacuation. The best tool that a close protection officer has is the ability to cover and evacuate the principal from that environment. Literally physically pick them up and move them from the spot, what we call the X. Well, that's not the time to have any discussion. None, right? They got to know, hey, if I got to move you, I'm going to move you. And, we established that very early on in our relationships. And I highly recommend that for any close protection officers who are listening. That client needs to know that if you have to move them, you're going to move them and they don't get a choice. And that can be very, very difficult. But you don't have time to negotiate when a guy's coming at you with a knife or a gun or whatever.
And so just going back to the point there, so that's a sort of conversation you would need to have at the outset. And again, that goes to the point about having face time with the actual client rather than just engaging with the director of security, because the relationship between you, the bodyguard, and your client, who's the person you're actually protecting, they need to understand what you're going to do. And there's a really famous scenario here where, you may be aware of this, James, where members of the royal family used to go to the SAS barracks in England. And they used to go through what they have called the killing house, which is a place where, the SAS will go into when there's a hostage rescue scenario. And they did it so that Princess Diana or whoever it was knew what to expect if that scenario played out. In fact, the famous scenario is they ended up setting fire to Princess Diana's hair in there. But on a grander scale, that's the same sort of thing in terms of the protectee needs to understand the rules of the game. What's going to happen in this scenario? I'm going to grab you. I'm going to physically lay hands on you. and shift you from A to B. And of course, there's all sorts of cultural challenges around that because, the US and the UK are culturally diverse. Lots of the clients may come from different cultural backgrounds where different rules apply. So you need to get that understanding out there that I'm only going to do this in these scenarios.
Yeah, I think I've worked there. I've worked all over the world, and I love kind of the European model and how they do protection. There's a lot of nuance to it, but in the U.S., everything's gun, right? When I'm working, in Japan, I'm not really worried about an armed attack, even though I really shouldn't say that with Abe, but that was a homemade gun. But I think your listeners understand the prevalence of that particular weapon. In the U.S., like it's everywhere. Everyone's got a gun. And so it's optically, it's so much different versus if I'm working, somewhere else where it's probably going to be a knife or, maybe just what we call an embarrassment attack with an egg or, white paint or something, which you see a lot of that white paint in London for some reason. Anyway, it's definitely different. The gun thing for us is very, very concerning. That's why we have like 25 feet of white space, and handguns are, obviously our real concern because there's more guns than people in our country. So,
so when you,
I think,
I was going to say, when you look now then and you watch what's going on in the UK, I don't know whether you've had a chance to watch some of the TV coverage of it, where the new King of England or King of Britain is meeting and greeting the public, and he's up close, shaking their hands and, taking flowers and what have you. And his protectors, I can spot them. You probably can as well. Are probably about 2 foot away from him. They will be armed, but that will be concealed. But it's people sometimes don't understand how that works in terms of allowing the King of England to be that close to the public in that environment. But that takes a certain sort of training, and you have to wrap around. That's what he wants to do.
Certainly, and. I don't know what they're doing because I don't know those folks, but more than likely they have plainclothes individuals who are kind of paralleling him as he's walking, and they're looking for pre-incident anomalies, those types of things. But I always tell guys, look, if you ever think that you're going to stop an attack with your pistol, you're wrong. I'll just tell you statistically, because we have it, we wrote the book. We've never seen that in the U.S. where an assassination was stopped preemptively by the use of a firearm. It's not happened. There have been I have some incidents in other parts of the world where that has happened, but in the U.S. it is not. And if you look at the majority of assassinations or assassination attempts, it's a lot of bodies to the gun, bodies to the guy, putting him down. Rushdie, just happened. They didn't shoot that guy. They put him down. Reagan, they didn't shoot Hinckley. They put him down. It's just very, very common because like in this scenario you were describing with the king, shaking hands, whatnot. If there is a threat, a lethal threat, and the protection officer draws their weapon and shoots into that crowd, I'd say that's going to be very, very difficult. You don't want to hit the little 6-year-old kid from, wherever she's visiting from. It's probably not a good idea. It's cover and evac. Put your vest around that principal. Get him to the hard car and get him out of there. It's not time to have a gunfight. I'm not saying that having a gun is some type of hindrance. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying the over reliance on a gun is a hindrance, and that's a very, very big thing. I call it the American way, which is unfortunately, a lot of individuals who hire protection, they'll say, well, I want to make sure he's armed. Well, there's a lot of other things I'd like him to be. I'd like him to be smart, or she. I'd like him to be smart. I'd like him to be licensed. I'd like him to actually have some education and background in close protection. I can give a damn monkey a gun. It doesn't mean they're going to be a good bodyguard. It doesn't mean I want them around my family. There's just a whole lot of other things. But again, that's the American way. We just equate guns to safety in this country. And I think that's wrong. Frankly, I think it depends on who has the gun. So, like after Parkland, they wanted to give teachers guns. Well, I don't know if that's a good idea at all. I don't know the teacher. That matters, right? But I've seen it. I've done that, Phil, not to talk, I'm not talking out of my my behind here. I mean, and if I've got a minute, I'll just tell you what happened to me in London. And this is a true story. In '07, I was in London doing an advance for the FBI director, and we had just had the 7/7 bombing, right? I was literally there so that he could talk to MI6, MI5 about counterterrorism and the Met about counterterrorism operations. And the Brits I was working with denied my request for a pistol permit. Well, I lost my mind. Saying that's bullshit, how dare you, blah, blah, blah. And because I had literally equated my protection ability to having that. And they said no. And I had to do the mission anyway. And it was like this beginning for me of there's so much more to this business that you don't understand. You think it's all about that. Well, if that's taken away from you, I call it the hammer doctrine. If that's taken away from you, now you're nothing. And I don't like to feel like I'm nothing, right? So that was a really great experience, even though I hated it at the moment, because now, I still carry, but it's all about logistics and planning and covering evac. What's my response to a medical problem? Those types of things that aren't gun related. That's the job, and it took me a while to learn that.
And I think that's such an important point because it's probably not what people think about when they think about a bodyguard. And I know because I've worked with them about how much of that preparation work goes into a lot of that. And actually also, I appreciate not necessarily so much in the private sector, but certainly with some of the government teams and what have you, how much support you've got from other agencies and other, the police officers stopping either side of the pavement so that the principal can walk unobstructed, etc. But I think your point you've made a number of times about the intellectual side of being a protector is one thing that I think is really important that comes out of this is that it's so much about understanding the intelligence, understanding your role, understanding the relationship between you and your protectee, understanding the area you're in, what's around you, what the threats in and around you. And as you pointed out, it may not be specific, it might just be location-wise. If you're going to certain parts of South America, they present a different risk just because of where they are, or parts of Africa or other parts of the world than, London, as an example. So There's lots of different issues.
One of the things I think about a lot is that, okay, if you don't know the game you're in, right, then you're really not playing it effectively. And what I mean by that is this, is if you don't understand arrivals and departures, the most dangerous place to be for a protectee, if you don't understand the theory of control spaces, if you don't understand white space, if you don't understand how protective intelligence feeds into, that threat matrix and, hey, okay, he might be here, but this is where he's going to target me, specifically the arrival, the elevator, the uncontrolled space, all that stuff. Okay, then if you don't know any of that, okay, then what your whole plan is I'm just going to be super vigilant. I'm going to be ready for it anytime, anywhere it comes, right? And I know guys who operate like that. Okay, I would say that's not a good idea. Why? Because you don't even know the game you're playing, okay? And you're going to have a heart attack. And no one could sustain that level of intensity for an 18, 19-hour day. My folks are working those types of hours, okay, like in a field day, like especially a field detail. Okay, you can't keep that intensity up. You just cannot. You're going to have a heart attack. But if you know the game you're playing, right, and you can know when to turn that intensity up, like an arrival departure, okay, now you're going to really be effective.
And when we flip back, you've referenced it a couple of times, and I often reference it in what I do, the attack on Reagan by Hinckley, where, for those who don't know, Hinckley was obsessed by Jodie Foster. That was his motivation to attack Reagan. So no protective intelligence is going to tell you that's going to happen. So, that attack was you couldn't plan for it, you couldn't prepare for it because it was out of the blue type attack where there was no direct connection. So that the skill of the bodyguards was to respond to that. Bearing in mind, as you point out, no rounds were fired by them, to cover Reagan and then to advance on Hinckley. But that requires...
Yeah, but they did some things. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying, but that requires real skill in terms of responding to that incident like that.
Yeah. Well, they did, so many things right that day. And I've been told, I wasn't Secret Service, FBI, but I've been told by the Secret Service, that they weren't even supposed to leave that day from the Hilton outside like that. They were supposed to go downstairs through the garage. But the staff and whatnot had asked if they could go outside so that, he's a politician, so that he could be seen by the crowd. Well, they did some smart things. They grabbed a rope from the concierge stand inside the Hilton, and they pushed the people back. They created white space. So that was very, very good. Tim McCarthy already had the door open. Huge deal. I always talk a lot about, do you leave the door open or closed on an arrival? And people will just look at me like, what do you mean? Well, okay. My great, great friend, he said, amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. Okay. So I'm going to ask you logistically, do you leave that door open or do you close it on the limo? If they say, well, we close it, I say, okay, if you have to cover an evac back to the limo, to your hard car, to your armored vehicle, is it easier to get into an open door or a closed door under duress? And everyone in the room will say, well, an open door, obviously. Well, then why don't you leave the door open? The Secret Service, Tim McCarthy already has it open. You can see any arrival and departure of the president. They always have an agent holding that door 1,000%, because you can jam them in there and close that big, heavy door. If it's closed, now you're going to waste the one thing you don't have any of, which is time, right? And so for me, when I'm auditing a detail and I see that, they leave the door open, good. They close the door, maybe not so good. Or when they close them down, if you let the principal in and then you close the door in, you should fully envelop that opening, right, with your body armor. A lot of times they do, a lot of times they don't. So I know, okay, they're not trained very well, but they did a lot of good things that day. Hinckley, most of the times they have to be very lucky, and he was very lucky. Yeah. He got to be able to be in that crowd. They happened to go outside. He happened to be armed. All those things aligned for him. And he was actually accurate. But he was, he worked that trigger field quick. He fired 6 rounds in less than 2 seconds. 1.7 seconds, I think he was on that trigger. And he's rocking that thing. And the guys just had to move. You don't have time to, draw, get a proper sight alignment, fire into a crowd. That's crazy talk. You're going to hit 3 or 4 civilians, and you can't do that here. I mean, I don't know. There might be some countries you can get away with that, but you can't do that here.
Fascinating. Really, really fascinating. I think, we've talked for nearly an hour, and we could probably carry on for another hour. Well, I certainly could, listening to you, because I think what comes across to me from this conversation is to be a professional close protection operative is far more of a skilled profession than people perhaps realise. There are so many more component parts to it than probably people realise. And it isn't, when it's done properly, it isn't just about some big guy that's, got a black belt in whatever else. It is for black belt in thinking and planning and all that before he worries about his martial arts potentially. And, the issues around control spaces and white spaces and all those various things which make perfect sense and are common sense with hindsight, I guess, but actually to have the ability for foresight and to be thinking about that all the time and making sure that you're thinking about those things and planning those things, that's where the real skill and the professionalism comes into it.
Yes, sir. And I love that, black belt and thinking. I just wrote that down. I'm going to use it if you want. I love that.
So listen, James, that's brilliant. I really, really appreciate it. I know you're obviously people will listen to this will know just how busy you are, and I'm grateful to Gabrielle and others for putting us together. I'm a huge fan of Gavin de Becker's work in terms of the 2 books you mentioned, and I'll add those to the link actually, because I think if you're listening to this and you don't have both of those books, I think you should go and buy both of those books. I often get asked by people, what sort of book should I buy? And I'm going to add those. I've got both of them, but I think I'm going to add those to my collection because I think they are key books. And even if you are not in this industry, even if you're just listening to this because you've stumbled across it, certainly The Gift of Fear is a book where there's so much information there, I think, for just everybody to think about personal safety and some of the issues around that. We haven't even covered instinct and all those bits and pieces, but as I said, we can go on forever. But James, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honour to chat to you and listen to you and hear about what the very best do and how the very best think and plan and behave and the qualities. And people the issue around confidentiality, which is such, I think, something that's taken for granted. And people, in this country, we talk about, have you got an NDA in place, which is frankly a worthless document, but actually the quality of confidentiality is worth more than having a piece of paper written on it. So thank you so much. I hope we can do this again sometime, because I'm sure there's so much more we can talk about. But Gavin, but James, any last thoughts, any last points that I might have missed that you might want to get across or reinforce?
No, just thank you to you for having me, and thank you for all the people that are listening, especially if you're a protector. Thank you for what you do. It's a very difficult job, and I thank you all very, very much for what you're doing out there, because it's, in my mind, it's a noble profession. It's been around for a very, very long time, and I often think if I had been there with Caesar, I think I could have saved him.
Well, on that note, we'll definitely finish. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Online Bodyguard podcast with host Philip Grindell, CEO and founder of Diffuse. Please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platforms.